Welcome everyone to this week's OMR Architecture Meeting. This week we have one topic to discuss. I apologize for the sort of rushed nature of it. I only had a short amount of time to prepare for it, but I'm hoping that we can make some progress on it. It is a bit of an older issue that that we've wanted to make some headway on for quite some time, and that is using the port library within the compiler or the Jit Builder components. More than a couple of years ago, we made the first step on introducing the port library as part of the build process, so that the port library and the compiler are coupled together that way. But we never went the next step to actually initialize the port library and start to use it within the compiler. Since that time, I mean, we had some use cases in mind at that time for the port library, but since that time, even more code has been introduced that could make use of it. Time that we revisited and rebooted that discussion. We had a talk at the OMR Architecture Meeting about 2.5 years ago in early 2018. And at that time, and I'm going to try to summarize the discussion from that time, but what basically happened there was we wanted to talk about a similar topic, but it sort of evolved into a broader architecture discussion around OMR component initialization and how it should be done. And there were many aspects of that of that discussion. I think there were a lot of good points that were brought out in there, but I don't think that there were a lot of concrete actions that came from that. But some of the discussions that happened were around what are the actual components within OMR that we really care about and that should be initialized. What are the dependencies between the various components? It's not really clear, so there was some desire to have more documentation on how the different components are dependent on one another and what the initialization path would look like. And then there was some discussion around whether or not these independent components are truly independent, in the sense that even though you may not be using a particular component, you still have to build it into your product. You can't just build it out. There's a runtime. It's only disabled by a runtime feature. So there is some thinking that had to go into that. We also had a bit of a discussion around the role of various data structures and what they mean. If you look outside of the compiler and Jit Builder, you'll see references to the OMR VM structure, the OMR VM thread structure. There's an OMR runtime structure, language thread, language VM. All these things need to be defined in some way, and I guess their use needs to be justified. And we need to understand what they actually mean and what they're truly for. There was some concerns that were raised on specifically about the port library and using the port library within certain components. How if multiple components need to use the same component, like the port library, how does that actually get initialized? What is you don't want to be initializing your own port library if one has already been created and initialized. So the discussion went on about how do you discover that a port library is available, and then there were things around that. But the one thing that we eventually all seemed to agree on was if we were going to redo the initialization approach for all these different components, what would it look like? And it's essentially we agreed that initialization should probably follow a 3-step approach. The first is to do a process-wide initialization, which would include things like the port library and the thread library. The next phase in that would be a VM-wide initialization, which includes things like the GC and perhaps some parts of the compiler. And then there would be a thread-specific initialization or a VM thread-specific set of initialization that would take care of the example that was given were some subcomponents of the garbage collector that needed that kind of granularity. So there was agreement that that was the way that we should go. At that time, Robert Young was working on some GC object model work and a GC builder component. And he had already done some refactoring of the GC in his own branch to test out that kind of an initialization scheme. And he found that that he was able to get that to work. So there was definitely some positivity there going forward. We also had a talk about Jit Builder and what its initialization needs are, and the desire to have a fairly simple, which is the whole point of Jit Builder, to have a fairly simple initialization interface for it. There was a lot of stuff that we talked about there, but in the end, we didn't really move that much closer to solving the original problem that we were trying to solve, which was how do we simply initialize the port library within the compiler. And I'd like to come back to that particular topic today to hopefully come up with a short-term solution to solve that without necessarily thinking about the much bigger picture of how the entire set of components need to be initialized and orchestrated, because I think that will need a lot. Well, the thinking on that has to go a lot deeper, I think, and it's more. It requires more effort than I think that we're prepared to put into that at this point. So I'd like to talk just about Jit Builder and Compiler using the. I mentioned that we've already got a build dependence on the port library, which is good. So the next step is really to create and initialize the port library. The proposal that I'll just throw out there is that we do that within the Jit Builder or the compiler is responsible for creating and initializing their own thread library and their own port library. And the reason you need both is the understanding is that the port library and thread library need to come as a pair. So we have to initialize both. So create them, initialize them, and then hang a pointer to the port library off of the compiler end structure. OpenJ9, biggest consumer of OMR, already does this. They have a pointer to the port library living on their specialization of the compiler end structure. So in the OpenJ9 code itself, the compiler code, they do use the port library from there. So there is some precedent on this. The hope is really just to extend that to OMR so that the various pieces of code within OMR, the OMR compiler can use that. So I think that in order to do that, we should simply just harvest the code that lives in the OMR initialized VM structure, the 20, 30 lines of code that's already there to initialize the thread in the port library, and simply reuse that. The challenges, one of the challenges is that there isn't really any standard API for initializing the compiler or Jit Builder. I know that we have like an initialized Jit Builder function. There's an initialized test Jit function. Other language environments that are consuming OMR have their own initialization methods. There isn't really sort of a standard API for that, but the things that they have in there are somewhat similar in the sense that you create a raw allocator, you have to create a compiler end structure, you have to initialize that compiler end structure depending upon the environment that you're in. So I think as part of that sort of series of steps that all these different language environments take, we should have another step in there to create and initialize the port and thread library fairly early on so that we can hang it off of the compiler end. So that might be an oversimplification of this process, but that's the idea that I'll throw out there. Happy to hear pros and cons of that or alternate solutions. So let's stop there for a moment, see if there's any comments, feedback.
What are the main uses in OMR for the port library that you're seeing? Is it like CPU feature detection or memory allocation or?
Yeah, the main thing at this point has been the CPU detection stuff.
Okay.
Because right now we're maintaining there's two versions of it, right? There's the older way of doing it, and then there's the version that was migrated into the port library.
Right, I see. Okay.
There's some duplication of the memory allocation code that's used in, for example, Jit Builder copies a bunch of code for allocating things that I believe is also present in the port library.
Right. Okay. So a question then, since you were saying you were going to hang a pointer to the port lib off the compiler object, is there going to be a factory or something, Mark, that's going to create the port library and everything for Jit Builder as part of its bring up?
Good question. So I remember one of the issues when we talked about this last time was that you're not really supposed to have more than one port library. That there are, at least historically, there have been some problems that have arisen when a second port library was attempted to be created. So it really is kind of a singleton type thing, as I understand it anyway. Unfortunately, there's nobody from the non-JIT team on the call right now to help us understand that. So we might want to follow up with some people on this. But my understanding is that there's only supposed to be one port library in the whole process, or maybe per VM. So somebody has to create it. I was just like, while Daryl was talking, I was going to look at the OMR startup code, and it basically just has a static variable that's the port library, and then you end up passing a pointer to that thing around. So I guess the question is, there's going to be a bunch of example uses out there of people who are probably leveraging similar code to what's in that OMR VM startup one, i.e. they're creating their own port library, or there's some port library being created at some point. So the compiler has to be able to either find that one somehow, which I don't know how it would do that necessarily, unless you start pulling in other things. And if it creates its own, then you run into this potential problem where others might have created it. And then I guess Jit Builder has the same issue, right? If you want to use Jit Builder inside something else, then you might have already allocated your own port library. But if you want to be just using Jit Builder in a standalone universe, when you call initialize JIT, that really should be creating the port library in this new world that Daryl's describing.
So we did talk about that last time, and I think that one of the solutions that came up was actually just to provide two APIs, one like an initialization API for Jit Builder that provides a port library and one that doesn't. And if you don't provide one, then you are on your own to go ahead or you should feel free to go ahead and create one and initialize it.
Yeah, okay.
But that doesn't necessarily broadcast the fact that you have now initialized a port library. And if there's another component that actually wants to use it, you're not communicating with that component to tell it that you've just created one. So
yeah, it's only one direction, I guess.
Yeah.
It would also have to be an opaque type to Jit Builder completely. That's not hard to do. I wouldn't want to introduce the port library type into the Jit Builder interface layer.
Mm-hmm. But that might be, so the question is whether or not that's, the multiple port library initialization, if that's a problem that we really have to solve at this point. And perhaps that's something that we worry about later.
So that might also depend on what parts of the port library the compiler component ends up using, right? Like if it really is only the CPU detection stuff, then maybe that's a facility that you can tolerate having 2 copies of the port library, because you'll just double up the queries from, you'll ask the same query of different objects and it will give you hopefully the same result. But there won't be any like state. Like I could imagine if you're doing memory actually I'm not even sure if the port library does the things that we're talking about now that I think about it more deeply. I'm not sure that memory, maybe the function calls are supposed to be there. Like the vmem allocate and those kinds of things. Anyway, so I guess the main summary there is maybe it doesn't matter for the things that the OMR compiler would use. There might not be any state that gets updated by the facilities that the OMR compiler uses that would cause a problem that there was 2 port library objects in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously that's a brittle kind of assumption to make. It might be true now, but it might,
Yeah. Well, I think whatever solution we'd have to vet with someone who's more intimately familiar with how the port library works and what the assumptions are that it makes.
Yeah. So I think Dan Hidinka was the one who ran into some of the multi-port library issues in the past, or he's someone who has run into those in the past, so we can consult with him a bit on that. The other problem with what you described for the approach for Jit Builder would be that the projects which have their own port library and use Jit Builder, those would all have to be updated, since they would be their own, like the way that by default calling initialize Jit would be going to create a second port library, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So those would be the ones that have consumed GC in the past.
Right. Presumably. So things like the Psalm, the JIT that Charlie wrote for Psalm, and the Lua Vermella, and those kinds of projects. Actually, I guess Lua Vermella didn't actually use the GC, did it?
No, it didn't.
Right. Okay. So we're safe on that one. So it's probably just the projects that Charlie and Robert have been like B9, I guess, and Psalm++ and
T4.
Yeah. Yes, T4. That's right. So I guess the good news is we know who those people are. I guess there could be other projects that we don't know about, but
okay. And I would also think that the amount of work needed to adapt should be relatively small.
Yep, I agree with that. Probably.
Yeah. So those are examples of one where library being created, which would mean, and if I understand those environments correctly, the port library gets created fairly early on in the initialization process, which would mean that perhaps it would need to get passed into Jit Builder for Jit Builder to consume, as opposed to Jit Builder creating its own or initializing its own.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Okay. So it would potentially need to have a second API, one that doesn't, or one that takes a port library and one that doesn't.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And there's already one that takes options and one that doesn't. So that means actually 4, I guess, at that point. Well, 2 additional ones.
Right. Okay. So in terms of actually initializing the port and thread library, I was thinking we could lift the 30 lines or so of code from OMR initialize VM. I don't think that OMR initialize VM should actually be the function that gets called. I think it should be, just because we don't need everything that's in there to do this. It's almost like we would create our own, either we provide a function in the port library to do this, or we create our own, let's say, that lives in the OMR compiler that is responsible for initializing the port and thread library. Should it need to create it? At least there it'll all live in one function. Could be used by Jit Builder or the compiler.
So I don't see anything in the code that initializes the port library that needs the OMR VM or the OMR runtime,
Yep.
but I do notice that the thread library seems to be being initialized first. Does it need any of that stuff?
I didn't see that. I wasn't actually even sure of the dependency between the thread library and the port library, because I can't see where the connection is being made between them. At least in that, if you're looking at OMR initialized VM, I don't see the code that actually makes there's no pointer from the port library to the thread library or vice versa. So I'm not sure what the dependency there is.
Yeah, I don't know either.
That's where it would have Robert on the call.
Yeah.
So we need to.
Yeah, I think we have to either dig more into this or pull somebody into the conversation who's more familiar with how this code interrelates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could pick on somebody right now, Nazim, who's actually done this in the past. Did you I don't know if you recall the code that you wrote there, but I know you have initialized the port library within Jit Builder. Did you have to? I think you had a relatively smooth experience with it. It wasn't like it was you had to do jump through a lot of hoops for that.
No, it was simple.
That correctly? Yeah.
Yes, I remember it wasn't that complicated to just pass an initialized port library into initialized Jit. I had to change the API to accept that, and then that was fine. And well, I don't remember much of the details, but I probably might be able to dig up the code.
So you didn't actually initialize the port library yourself. You just accepted one that was already created. Is that right?
One I initialized it myself as much as I remember. So.
Okay.
And if I remember correctly, I think the initialized port library API that I used checks if something is already initialized, but I could be wrong.
Okay, that would be something to look into as well. It could be handy, actually. Okay. I guess one of the things to make the discussion of this a little bit easier, and perhaps easier to broaden to other to pull in other people, it might be useful to actually have some kind of a pull request, like a work in progress pull request, just so that there's some real code in front of people to actually visualize and see what this what this would actually look like. So perhaps that is the next step here.
There's a small chunk of code in compiler trill tests, in the compiler trill test that initializes the port library. And it looks like it might actually be checking. Actually, I'm not clear whether it's checking if it's already been initialized or if it's just generally checking for errors initializing it. But the one thing that I do see from that code is it basically needs the thread library. You have to pass the thread library when you initialize the port library. So that's where the dependency comes in.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I've been grubbing through some of the data structures while you talked, and there is some of the TLS stuff surfaces in the port library's data structures. So it has the notion of some global thread that has a TLS key and a TLS mutex, and those are OMR thread structures. So bringing in the port library may require at least the thread library to also be and an OMR thread to be created. It looks like, for at least the thread that you initialize it on, maybe.
Forgot about the port usage in Trill. I seem to remember you actually doing the initialization. Yeah. Okay.
There's quite an awful lot of stuff in the port library, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the other kind of requests, I guess, that was expressed in one of the earlier conversations, was to not grow things more than we have to. But port library is kind of a kitchen sink kind of features and stuff. I mean, it's got NLS stuff in it. It's got CUDA stuff in it. It's got virtual memory stuff. It's got CPU stuff. It's got file stuff. It's got all kinds of stuff. Even J9 stuff. Actually, lots of it's identified as J9 stuff, but C group stuff.
I think they're just still using. Well, I think they're still using the J9 prefix, even though it may not
for
be
a lot of it.
specific.
Yeah, I think for anything that has to get used in J9 as well, it's probably been maintained. Alas.
Yeah. I mean, in the future, there could be some work to reduce the size of the port library by perhaps configuring it with only the parts of it that you need. If you don't need CUDA, for example, perhaps that could get built out, or if you don't care about the,
That's anyway, descending into the part of the conversation you didn't really want to have. So.
Back to the port library.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there's no fundamental objection from anyone on this call, I think that all in favor of this, but I think the next step is to really follow it up with some code that that we can talk to and talk to others about, so that we can hopefully refine it into something that would achieve what we want. Okay, so I'll look into either doing that or poking someone to that has an interest in this into doing this, and then hopefully we can make some headway here.
Cool.
Any other points anybody wants to raise or bring up with this? No. Okay. All right, then I guess it'll be a short call today. And thanks everyone for attending, and we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks. Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.